History lives as what it leaves behind. The past endures through brief flashes in the world we know today, but those flashes are ever fading, distorted by the passage of time. True history, as close as we can get it anyway, lives in the documents, photographs, films, stories. Our guest today began his career as an aviation photojournalist in 1957. He was just 9 years old. Through the lens of a small Kodak Brownie pointed to the West Texas sky, Jay Miller built the foundation of a career that would lead him face to face with some of the most famous aviators in history. In that time, he's cultivated an immense body of work that catalogues the story of aviation. Jay often says that his life is full of Forrest Gump moments, flares of serendipity that put him in the right place and time. In this first installment of a two-part conversation, we'll speak with Jay about his early days photographing aircraft in Odessa, Texas. He'll tell us how he came to know renowned aviators like Doolittle and Eddy Rickenbacker, how he acquired the mach meter from the first manned flight to reach a speed of Mach 3, and how a mistake made while photographing an air-to-air warhead led to an otherwise unattainable image. Through everything, Jay has maintained a childlike wonder in his life and work. He seems almost unaware of the fact that by dedicating his life to documenting and preserving aviation history, he has secured his own place in that same history. With this two-part episode, we hope to do with Jay a small part of what he has done with so many others in our field. Leave a lasting piece of a person and a story, captured in a fleeting chunk of time. This is Push to Talk with Bruce Webb, Episode 6, Part 1, Forrest Gump Moments.
Today, I'd like to welcome Jay Miller to our show. Anyone who's really an aviation enthusiast, perhaps a student of aviation history, or just aviation in general, probably knows Jay Miller. If you don't know the name, I would say you certainly know his work, whether it be a book, a magazine article, a television show, or a photograph. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Thanks a lot, Bruce.
Jay and I are friends. I think we've known each other probably 15 years or so.
Probably creeping up on that, yes.
Time goes quickly. And have flown together many times.
Some of the best flying experiences of my life, actually.
For me as well. You know, Jay has spent a lot of his career taking photographs from aircraft. I've spent a lot of my career flying photographers, cinematographers, doing video work. I would say Jay is the best at always being ready to get the shot.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, I can think of many, many, many times I've been flying with professional photographers. And, you know, we organized to get this great air-to-air shot, you know, and it's a moment in time. Maybe it's the sun coming through the window or it's the, you know, and you turn around and you see the photographers changing camera bodies or lenses. And it's incredibly frustrating from a pilot standpoint when you organize that. That never happens with Jay. Never. So tell me, you know, when did you start doing aviation photography?
If I may, I'll step back even a little further than that. My interest in aviation was, in effect, cultivated by my dad. He was the air transport commander in World War II and loved airplanes and aviation. And when he saw that I had some interest in that subject area, and I'm talking when I was 2 years old, that's how early all that started for me. He began making sure that when he went up to fly around with some friends and do things that involved aircraft, that I was always involved in those activities. And so that resonated with me even as a child. And probably by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I had a camera and basic Brownie. And I would go out and with my dad to the airport. And while he talked with friends of his, visited with friends of his in the aviation community, I would go around the ramp areas and take pictures of Cessnas and Pipers and whatever else I could find out on the ramp during those early days.
Do you have any of those photographs? Do any of those exist?
I have almost all of them
Wow.
still. Yeah, I've kept them all these years. To say that I went through a major shift in my perspective on airplanes and aviation, all of that occurred in 1957. I was born in 1948. In effect, I was 9 years old, but my dad brought home the 1957 edition of the Observer's Book of Aircraft, written by an author by the name of William Green, and he had an assistant by the name of Dennis Punnett. And Bill did all the textual material, and he put all the photographs together, and Dennis Punnett did the drawings for the book. But the Observer's Book of Aircraft was very small. It was literally about 5 inches by 3.5 to 4 inches, and it was designed to be carried in the pocket of your shirt and allow you to, any enthusiast, to go to an airport. And if they saw an airplane they couldn't identify, usually it would be in the Observer's Book of Aircraft. And this was an annual. It was put out every year starting in 1942. William Green actually took over in 1952, 10 years later. But he became the epicenter of all that involves the history of the Observer's Book of Aircraft. And in effect, he became my mentor, and that book is what sealed the deal, because that was the kind of book that absolutely resonated with me. There was a photograph of the airplane, there was text describing the airplane, there was a specification section, and then the right-hand page would be a 3D drawing done again by Dennis Punnett. And so that and the awakening that books like that were available started me collecting aviation books. And concurrently, I was continuing to take photographs at every opportunity. I went to all the local air shows. As you know, Bruce, I grew up in Odessa, Texas, and we were fortunate to have 3 major airfields there in the Odessa area. They were accessible to me. And interestingly enough, 2 of those were accessible by bicycle. And so I put a lot of miles on my bike going back and forth between our house and particularly Ector County Airport. In, I guess, about I'm going to say about 1964, I was still in high school in those days. I woke up one morning and I was thinking, by then I had a pretty well-rounded knowledge of aviation, not only in terms of being able to identify airplanes and talk about them, but also the technical aspects. I knew how an airplane flew, what made it fly, I understood propulsion systems and control surfaces and things like that. And this is literally the truth. I laid there in bed and I thought, I'd like to write a column for the newspaper. And the Odessa American was, as you might guess, was a fairly small hometown newspaper. But there was just something in me that said, you need to go down and talk to them and see if they might be interested. Well, I walked in, and I used to remember the editor's name. I can't think of it right now. But the point is, in those days, you could literally walk into the newspaper there in Odessa, and you could walk straight into the editor's office. If he was sitting at his desk, which he was in this case, you just walk in and introduce yourself, and he said, well, what can I do for you? And so I gave him a spiel on how, the Odessa newspapers, we've got a lot of aviation history in the area, and we really did. And there's a lot of aviation activity because Odessa and Midland are kind of halfway between El Paso and Dallas-Fort Worth. And so they get a lot of transient traffic through there.
Stop there a million times.
Exactly right.
If you fly from here to California,
exactly.
You're stopping in Midland, Odessa.
So somewhat to my surprise, he said, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. He said, why don't you do a couple of dummy pieces for me? And so each one of them, I had a photograph, and then I'd have the story, whatever it was I was writing about. If he had said no, we may not be sitting here having this conversation today.
Well,
but
life turns on the smallest detail.
Exactly right.
I believe, if I'm correct, that you have written well over 1,000 articles that have been published, magazine.
That's correct, yes.
And written and published 36 books.
That's correct, yes.
That are, in most respects, or in many respects, just very detailed examinations of an airframe or a particular aircraft.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
But you go into detail that is, I won't say infinite detail, but the most minute detail. Some of the books that you've written that really resonate with me, I was a big fan of the B-58 Hustler. I went to an air show with my father and my family, my mother and father. I think it was Grissom Air Force Base. It was probably I was born in 64, so this was probably 1970. I was 6 or 7 years old, and we went to Grissom Air Force Base. And they had B-52s there, and anyway, they had B-58 Hustlers there. I was mesmerized by that ship. And I know you've written the most detailed.
Well, it is considered to be the definitive history of the B-58 program. That book was published in 1985, and it's gone through one minor revision since. And, to give you a little perspective on this, copies of that book have been known to sell for over $500. And to me, that's mind-boggling, because when we were selling it, it was $24.95. So, but the B-58 is an airplane in particular that resonates with me. My dad's best friend was a test pilot by the name of Ray Tinhoff, and he was a B-58 test pilot. In 1960, April the 22nd, he was killed in a B-58 accident. And in effect, even though I was 12 years old at that time, that event became the, if you will, the ignition behind what eventually became that book in 1985, because from that moment on, I became conscious of going out of my way to specifically collect everything I could get my hands on about the Convair B-58.
And I believe, do you not have a photograph of virtually every serial number?
In the book, when it went to press, I think we had, of the 116 B-58s that were built, we had photographs of every single airplane except for 5. And during the years that followed the publication of the book, I did acquire photos of the other 5 missing aircraft. But we have never done a third edition of the book wherein I would have had the opportunity to put those in.
And that's just one of, I mean, again, for listeners, I would highly encourage you to just Google Jay Miller, look at the publications. He's done similar books on the F-22, the SR-71, all the X-planes. That's the X-planes, just what a broad category.
Well, that is another, there are 4 or 5 categories of aircraft that I have always had a strong interest in, though I want to say right up front, my interest in aviation is a lot different than most of the other aviation historians in the world. Most of them do have specialization, either eras or aircraft types or what have you. But my interests are all-encompassing. I have collected material dating back to the early 1700s on ballooning. I have information and data that I've collected on Chinese work that occurred in the pre-Christian era. And so anything that has anything to do with aviation, i.e. lifting a human being off the ground, I don't care whether it's hot air or gas or, jet propulsion system, I'm interested in. And my library that I put together, my research library, which Bruce, you know a little bit about, but at one time it was thought to be the largest privately held collection of its type in the world. And to give a little perspective to your listeners, the collection, when it was moved from Little Rock, Arkansas to San Diego, California, weighed over 30 tons. And we had books in that collection that dated to 1765. We had over 10,000 volumes total. There were 125,000 periodicals. There were 1,500,000 photographs. And then there were 2,000 artifacts, including a B-58 encapsulated ejection seat. I had a rocket exhaust nozzle from the North American X-15, which is still the world's fastest fixed-wing conventional aircraft. And for me, there were some little things in that collection. They're not little in the normal sense of the word, but I own the only complete original first edition set of Jane's All the World's aircraft in private hands in the world. And there are only 23, I think, complete sets known. So those are the sorts of things that, I spend a lot of time.
And this is why I believe when I think about what makes a person successful at any skill or what makes a person successful is that the same level of attention that you pay to your research, to your collection, is the same level of attention you pay to your photography or your writing. From my perspective, when we first met, hell, I didn't know you from Adam. I mean, hi, I'm Jay. You're a very humble person. I don't think I had any idea the depth and breadth of your aviation knowledge until we probably had flown together a dozen times. I had no idea. I knew you were an excellent photographer, and I knew I liked to fly with you, and we did a lot of fantastic things together. Interesting note, and Jay does know this, the last flight I have had was with Jay Miller. We were out at the Alaska Test Range doing air-to-air with a UAS. an electric UAS that is autonomous, and we went and did air-to-air with that.
That was my first time ever to fly with an autonomous, nobody sitting in the cockpit aircraft, and I have to tell you, that was a great experience. And
that was fun.
And it was doubly made great by you, and I mean that. It was, for your listeners, Bruce is a great guy, and he's a lot of fun to spend time with. But when you're in the cockpit and it's just the two of you, you can say things that you wouldn't normally say in public, and it was just entertaining. We were always happy. I think that was my if there's a big picture recollection of that particular experience when we were there, 2 days, 3 days?
I think we may have been there a total of 3 days. I think we flew 2 days.
Yeah, but I was always happy is what I'm working around to. And I can't say that for even a small percentage of the pilots I've flown with over the years. And I don't mean that to insult anyone, but you're just a different person. And anyway, Bruce and I have a lot in common. So,
yes, I appreciate that. Those are kind words.
Well, they're meant.
It's always fun when you meet someone, and every time you interact with them, you learn something else about yourself and them. Jay and I had lunch together. Now, it's probably been realistically 6 months ago, or I don't know. Time goes too quickly. But Jay brought with him an artifact that was incredibly rare. Tell us what you brought to lunch.
You mentioned earlier the X-planes, and if I may, I'll mention that I did write a definitive work on X-designated airplanes, and that starts, of course, with Chuck Yeager's Bell X-1, which was the world's first level flight supersonic capable aircraft. And so I wrote a book which is, most people agree, is a definitive work on all the U.S. X-designated airplanes from the X-1 up through the X-45. Now, since that book's been published, they're up to I believe, the X-61 or X-62, and I've been asked to do a second edition, but I can't get enthusiastic about it now at the age of 75. So, but the point is that the X-designated airplanes have always been of great interest to me, and very specifically, though, the one airplane that has always captured my attention and remains one of the apex airplanes in the history of my love of aviation and flying machines in general, is the Bell X-2, which was the successor, obviously, to the X-1. And the Bell X-2, on September 26, I believe, 1956, don't quote me on the exact date, but the point being that pilot by the name of Milburn Apt, and it was his very first flight in the X-2, actually reached a speed of 3.196 Mach. And that's the equivalent of 2,094 miles per hour at the altitude they were flying. I think that was at 55,000 feet. But anyway, that airplane always had my attention. And when I was a little kid, it was unquestionably the fastest airplane in the world. And over the years, I've been privileged to I need to backstep a little bit and tell you that flight wherein he reached that high Mach number, which was the first Mach 3 flight in history, I should say first manned Mach 3 flight in history, ended unhappily. And Milburn Apt, through no fault of his own, lost control of the airplane, and it impacted the ground with him still in it. And it was a fatal accident, and the airplane was totally destroyed. So over the years, there have been some mysteries associated with the X-2, and one of which is whatever happened to that Mach meter that was in that airplane. And about probably a year ago now, I had a call from a fellow who said, I possess something that I think you might find of interest. And as you can guess from where this is going, he had acquired the Mach meter from the Bell X-2. And the whole story is complicated, and I won't bore you with everything, but the important points are that that Mach meter had sat on the desk of the chief of flight operations for Edwards Air Force Base during 1956 when the accident occurred. He, as it turned out, had been the next-door neighbor of Milburn Apt, and Milburn's family and his family were very close. And so after the accident, he had asked for that Mach meter, and they had pulled it from the wreckage and had given it to him, and it sat on his desk for a number of years. So when he passed away, his son inherited that Mach meter. But his son turned out to be a bit of a hermit and a somewhat unusual personality. So he hoarded that mach meter, and to all intents and purposes, it disappeared. No one knew what had happened to it or what had even happened to him. But the friend who called me, he's now a friend. I didn't know him, of course, when he called the first time, but he said, Jay, I've got the mach meter from the Bell X2. And my reaction to that was, oh, yeah, sure.
Right.
He proceeds to send me some JPEG images over the internet. And the moment I saw those images, I knew it was the real deal. And how I could make that determination is too complicated here. But since then, that mach meter was built by Colesman Instrument Company, and they only built maybe 2 or 3 of them. And so effectively, those were the first Mach 3 mach meters in history. And that alone helped me determine that it is the real deal. Well, about a week later, this fellow shows up at my front door, and he's living, at that time, he was living in the Dayton, Ohio area, but shortly thereafter, he moved down to Florida, and we're still very much in contact. And he said, what do I do with this? And I said, it's very simple. I said, it needs to go to an institution where it's going to be preserved for posterity. And not just any institution. It needs to go someplace that is federally or state funded, because any private sector museum or whatever simply just does not have any guarantee that it's going to be here for a long period of time. Anyway, I'm making this too long, but the story is that he decided to leave the mach meter with me. And as I speak to you, it's in my safe at my house. It's a truly treasured and extraordinarily rare artifact. And we have now completed negotiations with the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and it will be on display there probably by the end of this year.
Right. That is fantastic. To see and touch something that is, it's a piece of history.
It really is truly a piece of history.
I consider myself very fortunate in my career. I've had the opportunity to meet many fantastic people, you being one of them. I know that you've had the opportunity not only to meet, but to have relationships with some fantastic people. I know that you have spent a lot of time with Eddy Rickenbacker. Eddy Rickenbacker. That's just incredible. I think, Eddy Rickenbacker, for most of us, lives only in, an old movie or a book.
Yeah, old history books, yeah.
What brought you together with Eddy Rickenbacker?
Well, in 1972, I was an active member of the Aviation Space Writers Association, which is long since ago, disappeared from the earth. But they used to have a national convention, and in 1972, their national get-together was in New York City. So I got a call to be there, and long story made very short, I made my name George Hadaway. I was too poor to make that trip, and George was kind enough to pick up my expenses. So, but he wanted me to be there, so I went, and it turned out it was one of the most significant events of my life in terms of the people I was able to not only meet but shake hands with and spend quality time with. Among others. Jimmy Doolittle was there. And so that's where I met Jimmy Doolittle, and later became friends with Jimmy and he had a couple of sons. Interesting side note to Jimmy Doolittle that not many people know is can't remember if it was during World War II or shortly after World War II, he had a son who committed suicide. And that happened while Jimmy Doolittle's son was based at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas. So Doolittle spent a lot of time in Austin during that period, and the son, part of that basically was blamed on simply Jimmy Doolittle's great fame, and his son was in Air Force. I don't remember now what his rank was. I want to say he was a colonel, but the pressure finally got to him.
Yeah, imagine that your father led the raid on Tokyo in April of 42.
Right. Yeah.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Perhaps one of the most famous, at least in our history. It certainly invigorated our
it was a morale booster beyond belief.
And a morale killer for the Japanese at the time. Yeah. It was a significant event.
It was, truly. And not only that, but what you got to build into the equation is the mechanism that had to take place for all that to happen, to take a B-25, which is a large twin-engine medium bomber, and to depart from the deck of the Hornet, aircraft carrier.
Right.
In terrible conditions, by the way. It wasn't, a bright sunny day when they took off.
And not at the planned time.
Right. And every one of them made it. That's a feat that even today amazes me, as much as I like to think I know about aviation.
Right.
But
well, certainly, yeah. So back to Rickenbacker. So you had, that's when you first met him.
That's where I met Rickenbacker, and again, Jimmy Doolittle, and there are quite a few other famous aviators there. Some of who have been basically forgotten to history, but they were still significant people. Rickenbacker, what a lot of people don't know is his previous, post-World War I life. He, among other things, was the owner of a company that built automobiles, and they were called Rickenbackers.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and they were actually fairly successful and reasonably decent cars. And the way he got into that is he became an automobile racer after World War I. And then another aspect of his life is he's the founding father of what was Eastern Airlines. And,
right, that I did know.
Yeah, and he was very active in the airline industry for a long time. If I may, though, I want to slide back and say one more thing about Doolittle, which was another great privilege of my life. After his passing, one of his surviving sons called me and said, we need somebody to do an appraisal of Jimmy's artifacts and all the things that he had gathered over the years. A sizable percentage of that was donated, and this is not well known. It didn't go to the Smithsonian or any the Library of Congress or any of the major institutions. But instead, because of George Hadaway, who I mentioned earlier, who was very close to Jimmy Doolittle, that collection went to the University of Texas History of Aviation collection. And at that time, that collection had been moved from Austin, Texas to it's a suburb of Dallas. It'll come to me in a minute. But that's where the University of Texas at Dallas is located. And I got called in to do the appraisal on that collection. And I bring that up only for one reason, and that is this is another one of what my wife calls my Forrest Gump moments. But I was going through the boxes of material, and there was this small little case with a felt covering on it, and then you probably know where this is going. And I opened that up, and it was Jimmy Doolittle's Medal of Honor that he had received for the Tokyo mission.
Wow.
And to hold that in my hands, and then at the same time be able to look at photographs of Jimmy Doolittle receiving that from President Roosevelt, that really caught my attention big time. That Medal of Honor is on display now at the university there.
We know aviation is still a relatively young industry. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess 117 years old.
Right, exactly.
118, whatever.
Yeah.
It's
and the things that have been accomplished during that period of time to go from basically a 30-mile-per-hour wooden fabric biplane, to vehicles that are now capable of re-entering the atmosphere at close to 20,000 miles per hour.
Right. Well, supersonic commercial aircraft.
Right, exactly. And they're coming back,
I think they are.
With the boom.
I think that they are.
So.
I don't know how you have time for all this. So between being an author, a photographer, a husband, a father, you're 75 years old. You're sitting here. I think you're in better shape than I am. We both have some of the same ailments, I think.
Yeah.
So what have you done? Because I don't see that you're slowing down. You must be slowing down some. So what's the last thing that you do that you will give up in aviation?
Well, that's a good question. I'm still able to do my aviation photography, and I do love shooting air-to-air in particular. And I still have a number of clients who call me in to do work for them. And, I had a good friend, Howard Levy. Howard's one of the great aviation photographers of the era, basically from the 1930s up through the 1960s. And his collection, by the way, went to the Smithsonian Institution, which was good. But my point being that he was well into his 80s, and he was still shooting air-to-air photography. Yeah. He tended to limit himself to mostly home-built aircraft and old biplanes and, things like that. But regardless, it's still a difficult proposition. And the older you get, one of my big issues now is I'm often forced to climb in and out of aircraft that are not really made to carry two people. P-51s, for example, and on at least one occasion, a P-38. And I'm in the P-38s don't have a back seat. and you're literally sitting on the main spar that goes through the fuselage, or what's to all intents and purposes fuselage on P-38. But anyway, so that, there was a time when I was 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Hell, I didn't care about any of that. Yeah, man, I'm ready to go. But now I have to think about it a little bit. I really do. It's not easy.
So you mentioned the 51 and a 38. What do you consider to be the most exotic aircraft you've ever flown or ridden in? Because you are, although not a licensed pilot, you've got, for the listeners, Jay, we've done some flights together where we were ferrying aircraft back, and I remember one specifically, we were flying back from somewhere in an EC-120, and this ship did not have an autopilot, so Jay was a very capable and willing autopilot, so Jay flew me back to Dallas.
It's debatable how much I did on that, but...
But you've got a fair bit of time in a lot of different aircraft.
I estimate about 600 hours, and it's one of the things about being an aviation photographer. You do get to fly in a variety of airplanes, and I keep a log of that, and I've got a little flying time, 163 different airplane types. But you ask, which one is
exotic? What's the most exotic?
It's going to surprise everybody, but the most exotic and actually one of the rarest airplanes I ever got to fly was a Spartan C-260, which most people have never heard of.
Never heard of it.
Well, the interesting thing is it's powered by a little three-cylinder engine, and the rocker arms, everything is exposed. And I remember sitting in this little side-by-side cockpit, and as you're looking forward, the engine's, 4 feet in front of you, and it's only 70 horsepower, if my memory serves. But I was mesmerized by the rocker arm that I could see on that top cylinder just going up and down all the time.
Right.
But that airplane was built in the early 1930s, and there are only 2 of them left in the world, and this is the only one that's still flight-worthy. And so for me, it was a real treat. And I've flown supersonic airplanes, and my first supersonic flight was in a McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. And I had the privilege of flying a TF-102, and it, though I'm not a big fan, it was almost certainly the same airplane that President Bush was being trained in down at Ellington Air Force Base, yeah. Then probably the most unique high-performance airplane flight I ever made, we went up in an F-101, and this was in, trying to remember the base down in Florida. It's primarily used for air interceptor training and what have you, Tyndall Air Force Base. Anyway, so I was flying out of Tyndall in an F-101, and but before we took off, they gave me the privilege of picking which weapon I wanted to fire from this F-101 because we were going to go up and shoot down a drone, or try to, as it turned out. So the one the weapon I picked was the Genie, is what it's called, MB-1 Genie. And the Genie at that time was the only nuclear warhead missile in the air-to-air missile in the U.S. Air Force inventory. And so they rolled out obviously
didn't have a weapon.
We'll call it a neutered Genie. And there's an interesting little photography side note to that. So I had never photographed a air-to-air missile. Done a lot of other stuff, guns and what have you, but we were up, I don't know, probably at 45,000 feet, and we had a Firebeat drone that we were going after. And it was just a dot on the horizon. I still remember I could see that. He gave me a countdown, and, I've kind of gotten a little bit off the beaten path. I've left everybody with the impression that was mounted on our F-101. It was actually mounted on a California Air Guard Convair F-106 because this was going to be an air-to-air session. I apologize. I should have prefaced everything with that. But they gave me a countdown. And my camera at that time was a Nikon, it's irrelevant, but the point is it fired at 8 frames per second. And so I had it on the 8-frame setting, but for one reason or another in my excitement, I'd forgot to set the aperture. And so they gave me a countdown, and so I started the motor drive going at about, at the 2, 1, and 0. That missile departed that F-106 so quickly. I mean, first of all, when the engine ignited, it blinded me. I mean, that's how bright it was, and we were pretty damn close when all this happens. And that missile was gone in like 2 frames at 8 frames per second. But a minute later, I'm thinking, oh my God, I forgot to set the aperture. Well, it turned out it was the most perfect exposure because of the brightness of that engine, of the rocket engine. If I had set it the normal settings I used, the image would have just been blown out. When you say blown out, that means it's so bright that there's no detail left in the picture.
Uh-huh.
That photo was used in a number of different magazines.
That's how, so even the best of the best
right,
can...
right,
yeah.
Exactly. We make mistakes,
Right.
big ones.
We are human. We do make mistakes. You're talking about, some of these famous people. I know I've heard you talk about Scott Crossfield being someone. Your father knew a lot of these people, yes?
No, actually, my dad didn't. But my dad's close friend, who I've already mentioned, Ray Tenhoff, when he was killed in the B-58. Ray was the founder of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. And his cohort in that was Scott Crossfield. And if I may, I'd like to tell a quick story about all of that. So when Ray was killed, my mother and dad got a phone call from Ray's family, and they were living in Fort Worth, which is where the B-58 was built. And we were in Odessa. And the next morning we got up and we drove straight to Fort Worth. The adults already knew that Ray was dead, but I was 12 years old at the time, and I just absolutely refused to accept that. I mean, he was God Almighty to me. There's no putzing around about that. But a guy by the name of Ted Tate, who later became a very good friend, he was a flight test engineer, and he was at the house, at the Tenhoff's house at the time all of this was going on, and he came in and he said, "Come here, I got something I want to show you." And he walked me back into Ray's office in his house, and sitting there on that table was a letter from Scott Crossfield. And next to it was a photograph of Scott Crossfield standing next to the X-15. He was the first X-15 pilot. And incidentally, I need to mention that Scott was also the first man to fly twice the speed of sound. Chuck Yeager was the first to fly supersonic, and then Scott Crossfield was number 2. So here's the thing. That photograph was sent to Jay from Scott Crossfield. And when you're a little kid, and Scott Crossfield at that time was arguably the most famous pilot in the world. And I looked at that picture and I just couldn't believe, well, Ray had written Scotty and asked, everybody calls him Scotty, by the way. He said, Ray or Scotty, would you sign a picture for my friend Jay Miller? And so there was that picture, and there was a letter, and you'll have to forgive me if I get a little emotional about this, but so Ted Tate said, "Here, take this," and I absolutely refused to take that picture because I just knew that Ray Tenhoff would come back and send that picture to me, and so I walked out of there and left it. Well, over the years, Scotty and I became really close friends, and we talked about that picture several times. We actually laughed about it a little bit, and obviously because of our friendship, I have many, many things signed by Scott Crossfield. But that one picture had always been kind of plaguing me, if you will. So let's see, I have to think now how long. Let's see, the Ray's accident was 1960, and so probably about 2000, 2001, I get a phone call, and it's this fella, and he says, if this is Jay Miller, I've left out, this was a message on answering me. It was Jay Miller, who was Ray Tenhoff's friend. Would you please call me? And so I knew in an instant, anybody who said anything about Ray Tenhoff, that I was going to call him back right then and there. And I called him right back, and he said, look, I am the husband of Ray Tenhoff's second wife's daughter. And we were digging through she died, Ray's second wife had died. And, we found this picture and this letter and wanted to know if you wanted to have it. And so basically 40 years after the fact, that showed up at my front door. And, man, that meant a lot to me.
Right. Yeah, I think that would mean a lot to anyone.
And so...
And again, another piece of, so much of the history we only know what we read or see, right?
Yeah,
We don't know,
right.
you talk about being lost to time. And that's a little bit of the purpose behind what I'm actually doing here with Push to Talk
Right.
is there are a lot of people in this world that have done extraordinary things who we interact with, honestly, on a daily basis.
Right.
And we have no real understanding or appreciation of their place in the history of aviation. They get lost to time, and we don't want that to be lost to time. And I'm not trying to be morbid,
No.
but I do believe that, how many people in Tarrant County or Dallas, Texas have ever met Eddy Rickenbacker
Right.
or knew Scott Crossfield or knew Joe Kittinger or Buzz Aldrin or Chuck Yeager or Neil Armstrong or, not to be name dropping, but the list of people you've met, and not just met, know, is astounding.
Many of those folks have had dinner at my house, and I'm always very conscious of who's sitting there. In fact, that's sometimes debilitating because you realize that another person was. Not many people know that Nikita Khrushchev's son was a key player in Russia's space race, and particularly the one to the moon. But the interesting story about his son is that he was sitting on his dad's lap when the phone rang, and it was a call to tell him that Sputnik had been launched and had been successfully inserted into orbit around the Earth. And he remembered that well, and he spent 2 days with Susan and me. So
right,
but
and then later you wrote a book about the MiG-29 and another Russian airplane. I'm not a fixed wing guy. I'm a helicopter guy. And you actually spent time in Russia.
Yeah, I made 3 trips to Russia, and the first one was for me the most interesting because I had the privilege of spending a day with the Mikoyan Design Bureau and Rastislav. His names are going to slip by me now, but I'll get back to that in a minute because I can't remember his name. But anyway, he not only was at that time the director, and by the way, directors are like CEOs in Russia, and he was the director of the Mikoyan, or what now is the Mig Design Bureau. Mig, incidentally, is spelled with a capital M, a little I, and a big G, and the MI part stands for Mikoyan, but his partner, when they founded the Bureau in 1935, Gurevich was his name. And when Gurevich died somewhat prematurely, Mikoyan wanted to make sure his friend was not forgotten. And so it became the Mig Design Bureau. And later they attempted to refer to it as the Mikoyan Design Bureau, but they have since been acquired by another massive conglomerate operation in Russia. And so the MiG name is starting to slowly but surely disappear. But I just wanted to mention that. Anyway, I spent time at the MiG Design Bureau with the head of that bureau. And then I spent quite a lot of time at the Sukhoi Design Bureau, and also spent some time with the head of that design bureau. And then I've got to tell a quick story about, do we have time for this?
Sure, no, absolutely.
So quick story about the Yakovlev Design Bureau, and this is one of those serendipitous Forrest Gump moments again. But my phone rings one day, and they were having a NBAA get-together in Dallas. And it was a lady, and she said, I'm with the local Chamber of Commerce, and we've had a call, and they're looking for somebody to give a couple of guys from Russia a little tour of all the aviation activities, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And somebody said you might be the person. And I said, well, sure, I'm happy to do it. I've got the time. And so that evening, I drive over to the hotel in Dallas, and this is hopefully not meant as any kind of insult, but there were probably 100 people milling around in front of this hotel, which was closely associated with the NBAA event. But I could have picked those 3 Russian guys out of the crowd in a heartbeat. So they see me waving
a bit
at
serious
her.
looking, perhaps.
Well, it's their dress as much as anything,
Sure. Well, Americans stick out in other countries as well.
Exactly. So I see these guys, and I wave at them, and they come kind of semi-running over, and they climb into my car, And so I struck up the conversation. I said, do any of you speak English? And one guy says, yeah, I speak English fairly well. And I said, well, tell me what you guys do and who you are. And he said, and I can't remember all three of the names, but he said he was basically the number 3 man in the Yakima Design Bureau. And I'm not going to use the language that I used at the time, but I'll just say, no kidding. And then he introduced the other guy, and he says he's the deputy director of the Yakima Design Bureau. And I said, wow, holy cow. And then the final guy, as you might guess, was the director of the Yakima Design Bureau. And I'll think of his name in a second. But anyway.
So they're all in your hands in Dallas,
right.
Texas.
And I said, does anybody at the NBAA know who you guys are? And he said, no, nobody knows. And I said, in the Chamber of Commerce, do they have any idea who you are? And they said, no, we didn't say anything to anybody. So, that'd be like having the chairman of the board of Lockheed Martin getting into the back of
right.
with his 2 senior vice presidents,
Right.
So, man, I'm telling you, the following 24 hours, I'm not a drinker. I don't touch alcohol unless I absolutely have to.
But perhaps they do.
But, oh, my gosh. And so I took them, they had got to eat barbecue until it was coming out of their ears. And because they wanted to.
Sure.
I said, we ate lunch and we had barbecue, and they just, this is terrific, went on and on. Well, like 5 hours later, we're in another barbecue place. So anyway, we hit it off well, and we ended up at my house. And at that time, my library was there at the house, and in fact, it was the house, my library. And
Susan really appreciates that. I'm sure.
Susan used to wake up
well
on
decorated
her airplane. But he Alexander Dundikoff, that was the guy, and so Alex. He gets lost in my library, and it is like 3:00 in the morning. And, I went back and I said, it's about time to go home maybe. And he said, I want to look at this. He was looking at all the rare books and what have you. Well, his 2 buddies walked in, and they literally picked him up. One of them had each arm, and they carried
Time to go.
Right, carried him out to the car, and I took him back. But here's the beautiful part of the ending of that story. I made 3 trips to Russia, and on the second trip, Sasha Volovich, who's my escort and is still one of my very good friends, and he was the retired chief engineer on fly-by-wire flight control systems for the MiG-29. And Sasha took me over to the Yakima Design Bureau because Dundikoff had found out that I was in town. And I got a tour of the Yakima Design Bureau that I still look back on. And not only that, I could take my camera.
Did you take them barbecue?
No, if I'd known that was going to happen, I would. But Dundikoff actually became the, I'm trying to remember, he was kind of the equivalent of Secretary of Defense there in Russia after his tenure with the Yakima Bureau.
Unbelievable.
Come back Thursday, January 26th for the second installment of our conversation with Jay Miller.
The information provided during this podcast, Push to Talk with Bruce Webb, is made available for general information and educational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Airbus Helicopters, Inc. or its affiliates.